Thanks, Steve, for being with us today and letting us hear your wisdom, your water wisdom, your soil wisdom of the land. We think you have something very unique to say, and that will help fill in information for all of us that are looking for our way into the future in these water challenged times. Yeah, you had mentioned about the whole farm. So you want to start there with the farm as a whole entity?
In our case, we're trying to work with the farm as a whole organism. And that means that we want to pay attention to all the organs, which if we did a real simple explanation, we would say the physical or the soil, and we would say the plant or etheric life of the farm, and the animal or astral life of the farm. And then, of course, it's not a farm unless there's a human being involved. So the human part of the organism is also a critical part. And when we talk about an organism with different organs, these organs are all working together in mutual support of each other's activity. And you can only achieve a real health throughout the organism when all of those organs exist in that organism and they are all working together and supporting each other's life and activity. And that's what's really exciting to me, actually, about a biodynamic farm, since this is a biodynamic farm, meaning that we use certain biodynamic practices to culture the soil and also the compost that we build to feed the soil and to create overall health and balance and life support, life activity. Bio is life, dynamic is activity of that life. We're trying to support all of the life and growth forces as fully as possible. So in terms of the soil, we're trying to achieve all of that biological life because if there is adequate organic matter, like 5% or so, then you can support all the microorganisms that are part of the animal life, but in the soil. There's a cow's worth in 1 acre of ground. There's a cow's worth in weight of biological organisms, worms and bacteria and fungi and molds, and all of those things working together are what create the fertility release in the soil. And we can only have that happening if we have the organic matter there, so that's really important. And creating compost out of the farm organism itself is a real key. And then using biodynamic culture, there's a field spray that's used to help the humus development in the soil and the fertility, basically, development of the soil, rooting capacity, soil texture, and so on. That biodynamic spray is called horn manure, and it's put on the land when we're tilling it, getting ready to plant. There's also the horn silica, which is made out of crystal ground very finely, and water is the carrier for both of these preparations to get them on the land, or in the case of the plant, the horn silica to get it on the foliage of the plant. So those are critical to supporting all this biological life in the soil and in the farm, which enables it to be healthy and make the maximum use of water.
Let's talk about that maximum use of water and how perhaps you feel you're using less water. I mean, I know you have a lot of water available here, more than I do in town, for example, but how can we relate this to people trying to keep their garden alive this year? Let's just talk about that.
One thing I noticed when I started using the biodynamic sprays and preparation in this farm, which was like 1986, was that after a year or two, the soil texture would open more easily, even though it was under dry conditions. I could get, more penetration with the discs and the tillage. And also, I didn't have to continue watering for as long of a period. All of our water here is overhead because drip irrigation, we have a lot of minerals and it doesn't really work for us. plugs up all the equipment really quick. So we're working with overhead watering, that's my context. But I did notice a lot less, I could do shorter run times for the water because of the condition and health of the soil. And that, besides the preparations, the soil, horn manure and horn silica that I mentioned before, there's 6 preparations that go into the compost pile. So building that compost and using those preparations to culture that compost makes a compost that has a more lasting effect, in my experience, in the soil, and creates conditions for more enhanced biological life and development, which is the key to the healthy soil, the fertility, and also the water use. And in order to put that in context of the whole farm organism, we have animals in the farm as much for their fertility, their role in the fertility cycle, the manure that they create, and grazing the grass, helping us maintain the soil in a healthy and more lively way. And so the way that we use the animals, starting with a field that is in grass, say, we have that grass growth there, and we use intensive grazing, strip grazing. So we put the animals in on a smaller strip, and they basically eat off all the growth, the good plants and the not so desirable plants at the same time. And what that does is then they're moved to a new strip. And so when they leave the old strip, then those plants can start to regrow. As they regrow, they are shooting a whole flush of root growth into the soil, which is penetrating deeper, also creating more organic matter in the soil. And then, of course, you get more top growth, and you come back with the livestock and harvest that. And while they're doing this, the livestock are also manuring that soil. Well, we also enclose our livestock at night in the corral so that the nighttime manure is in one spot that we can pick up, and we use that to build compost. So we generate all the compost for this 50-acre farm, which mostly goes to the vegetable fields, which are 3 different 4-acre areas of the farm where we grow produce and intensive crops. But we generate all the compost for that from the whole farm organism of the animals, being grazing and using these other fields and helping us grow soil basically in those fields. So we do about 50 tons of compost a year out of the farm itself. That is a big difference to what generally we talk about sustainable farms nowadays, and the compost is coming from a plant somewhere. All the material has been hauled in to there and then composted with a lot of energy and machinery, put back in a truck, hauled out to a farm and spread. And if you look at the whole energy and carbon footprint of that approach, and that's not just compost, it's also the animal feed if it's not grown in the farm. A whole farm organism would attempt to grow its own animal feed also. So those are carbon footprints that are affecting our climate. I think scientists at this point pretty much agree that climate disruption is something that's real and that we need to deal with. So by working at the farm or the garden from this concept of a whole farm organism, trying to create those inputs within that organism and use them within that organism, and then maybe your intensive crop, in our case vegetables for 200 households, is the part that's exported from the farm, but everything else is cycling within the farm. So back to this cycle of growing soil with the animals, after they graze, they manure, and then we might spread compost, not every single year or season, it's not necessary, but just to keep adding a certain, of this cultured, biologically active, biodynamic compost to that soil to help the humus development. And then at the appropriate point, we disc that ground in. We turn in all of that organic matter that's in the root development that's come from the strip grazing, the intensive grazing, plus compost if we have it and can put it on there, and any organic matter, top growth that's there, that's all turned into the soil. So this is like a big, meal of organic matter and activity that then is feeding the soil, stimulating all of the soil life that we talked about before, and creating the texture and fertility capacity and also the organic and textural capacity of the soil, that it can retain water when there is water that comes. And you don't need as much water to manifest the fertility and support the crop plants. And so then that cycle is started over again after it's all been tilled and that meal has been supplied. Then we sow a new set of seeds, grass and forage, and we get growth again, and that whole cycle starts over again in the farm. So we're actually growing the soil. If we can grow healthy soil, then our crops are kind of a byproduct. We're going to have good crops. The key is to grow the healthy soil. The livestock can be a key in growing that soil. The overall system of the farm, if we create those inputs from within the farm, we have a much lower carbon footprint. So maybe we're getting to a kind of agriculture that can be truly sustainable within the scale of its own organism. And so in our case, we're combining modern technology of photovoltaic electricity. We've got about 30 kilowatts of photovoltaic electric going that we use for water pumping. And then we're using the draft horses for the soil tillage. So we're trying to get away from mechanized fossil energy-based agriculture. And the draft horses are not only giving us the energy to work with the soil, to till and aerate and, do these feeding cycles throughout the different fields of the farm, of which there are like 16 or 18 different fields that we can work with in this way. But they are also giving us manure. So I think that it's actually a very efficient system, that it's not as fast as mechanized agriculture, but it's within a scale that fits with the natural conditions and laws and balances, so that we can create an agriculture that is self-productive out of its own farm organism. And if we could get our food system to be based in the same way with the people surrounding a farm, getting their food from the farm, this is back to the human part of the farm organism. I always thought, well, the human part of the farm organism, that's the farmers and people working the ground, but actually, in fact, it's everybody that eats from a particular farm is part of the human organism of that farm. They're being fed from that soil. And today, the modern system of long-distance transportation, 1,500 miles of your food before it's on your plate, it's a complete disconnect. You can't know where your food is grown, who's taking care of it, if that farm is viable and successful and is going to be there in the future. All of those things are just left to chance in the market. It's kind of a big gambling casino, in my view. So if we could start to coordinate the people around the farms, like in our case we're feeding 200 households, if those 200 households were around our farm organism, then they could help carry its well-being in their consciousness, and through their monetary support of the annual operating budget, they could ensure that that farm could be economically viable and exist into the future. And they would also be achieving a good staple part of their food supply of really high quality food that was being produced in a very conscious way, and that also had a completely different carbon footprint in the broader environment of the world, which is all part of our lives. I mean, what's going on in the world around us is in direct relationship and effect to our own existence. And so if we can get fed, but at the same time support a kind of farming that will help bring healing into the whole world environment, then that's a really valuable direction to put our energy into.
The thought that I'm a part of all this. And,
yeah, you are.
That the CSA, community supported agriculture that you offer us, is a method that's allowing me, to pick up my food and just every week, and it's beautiful. And that all these things are happening for my life to be reducing its footprint by eating this local great food that's been so thoughtfully and mindfully created. I really want to thank you for that. Let's just get a couple more things said. Talk a little bit more about water as a sacred source of life and how we share it. Water is commonly held. Can you speak to water in a different way for us?
Well, I think that we want to realize that water is like the earth, like the plants, like the animals, everything that we have is actually a gift. We didn't create it. We didn't make the plants, we didn't make the soil, we don't make the water. It's all an absolute gift to life. And all other life is a gift to our human life. For us to start to be more conscious in recognizing those relationships and make them mutually supportive relationships instead of one-sided, just taking and using. But it's when we have a real relationship with something that we come to know it and respect it and care for it and love it. So I think, especially in the case of water, it's such a communicator to all the other aspects. I mean, in the farm, with throughout the soil and throughout the life of the plants and through the animals, it's all bringing its influence, and we can't live without it. And so we need to try to really use it very, very consciously, and working through a whole farm organism and creating conditions that will sort of conserve and sequester some of those elements is critical for us to learn to do, and not just use them in a careless way. So for us, especially with the biodynamic preparations, when we want to spread the horn manure on the soil, we stir it in water for an hour, and we create a vortex in one direction and then break that into chaos, and we create form again in the opposite direction. So we're constantly moving through this form and chaos with the water. And actually, people have taken pictures of it's like a funnel in the bottom of a tornado, pictures, and the water begins to pulse through the motion, the energy that we're putting in creating motion. Water is definitely connected with motion. We can observe that, When you stir it rhythmically that way with the biodynamic preparations, then the influences and life forces that they support get activated and become part of that water activity, and we're like enlivening that water. Nature does this process too in streams where the water meanders and moves and there's vortexes and things, but we're doing it in a very conscious way. And then when we spread that water back out on the soil, preferably when the soil is damp, so that the moisture of the preparation and especially enlivened water can connect with the body of water in the earth, then we bring those influences into the earth and the life activity.
It harmonizes the other waters to itself and
Yeah.
raises its level of liveliness or vitality.
This is creating something very special, because nature has its processes, but it's only the human being that would have the consciousness to work with water in this very specific way to try to support and enhance its life-carrying capacities, and then give that prepared water, which is different than just the natural water, to give that prepared water back to the living organism of the farm in support of its life and activity. That's the preparation materials are all coming from natural elements, whether it be plant or animal sheaths or natural plant material, but it's only the human being that would consciously put chamomile into the small intestine of a cow and create a chamomile ferment and special preparation to give to the compost to help guide all of the decomposition activity related to calcium and sulfur processes and things like that. When we make this special material that only the human being could make out of human consciousness, it's coming out of natural elements, but being put together with human consciousness, then we give, in a way, a medicine or something that's enlivened and enhanced back to the living organism of the earth. And so that's a special role that the human being can take. And the motivation, well, there is higher quality in the food. You're not necessarily going to have higher yields, although your yields will probably be as good as any organic farming system. But the quality and life vitality of that food will be higher, and its keeping ability will be higher. Unfortunately, there's not a large supply of biodynamic food available, like on an open, economy. So people don't have a chance to try it and learn about it through their own experience. And that's happening more in the realm of wine, where biodynamic wines have won a lot of the taste tests, contests and things where they've checked on it. So, but it's also true of food, and we need more biodynamic farms, I would say whole farm organisms. The farmers totally need the people that are eating the food to come in and support, because without those people supporting those farms, the farm needs the eaters as much as the eaters need the farm. And it's totally a two-way street of mutual support. And if we could get that into a conscious street where we use our money to help, the other pole do the work that it needs to do, then we're using our money to create the good of the whole community, rather than using our money like in the market economic individual capitalism system to try to accrue gain for one private party or stockholders or whoever. That's a completely different economic process. What I'm talking about in this whole farm organism is more of an associative economic process.
The water cycle this year, the late rains, your comments on how difficult the dryness, now the late rains, because people don't believe there's a drought anymore. They think, oh, we see water, the rivers are flowing, there's no drought, no worries, let's go back to using a lot of water. That's one piece of it. On the farm, what is this water cycle this year, 2014, the late rains doing to the farm cycle?
This year is going to be a very challenging spring. We're coming out of serious drought that really, we had to try to make adjustments earlier in the year. We sold a third of our cows, for instance, as a starter, and we also planted some crops even without rain, forage crops in the winter, in order to try to make sure that there would be a little bit to eat, and hoping that our soil fertility and condition would support the growth of that, which it actually surprisingly did, even though there was no water until these rains started to happen in March, I guess. But it's a long-term situation, so we still have to be very concerned about water. So water is life, and life brings more life in terms of the farm, so we're going to want to try to use our water as conservatively as possible, but also we do need to use some to try to maintain that life activity in the whole farm organism. So one thing we can do is monitor our use, so that we can make sure we're not overwatering or using more than we really need to. I think that you can only conserve so far without starting to eliminate some of your crops in your life. And in the long run, that would have really serious long-term repercussions. So I'm hoping that we don't have to go there. I'm hoping that if we're conservative about the way that we use the water, if we can keep the soil covered, and that is maybe one measure that even in a home garden people could try to plant some, clovers and cover crops. Clover amazingly doesn't require as much water, it seems, as other plants. I was watching this happen. We have 2 acres of irrigated red clover for forage, and even during the freezing of the drought and the totally dry, like that clover was starting to get ready to grow. And with the first rain that we did get, even though it wasn't much, that clover really took off. So I think if we can keep our garden areas covered with a plant like that doesn't require huge amounts of water and can still, get nitrogen from the air and continue the fertility process and the enlivenment process in the soil, then maybe even just digging a strip through there to plant your plants. If you're on a home garden scale, you could do that. And I don't have experience with using like cardboard mulch, but there is a farm in Sonoma County, Singing Frogs, that does that quite a lot, and that would be another technique possibly to look into. And then it's basically no-till planting. They just plant right into it. But I think the key, if you are working with larger areas of ground and you have to use tillage to some extent to replant and control growth and everything, it should be a key practice to try to keep that land covered with something live that doesn't require a huge amount of water, such as a lot of the legumes could be used that way. And there's cool weather legumes and there's hot weather legumes, so you've got both possibilities. The cool weather and hot weather legumes would be different clovers and vetches and peas would be in the cool weather period, and you could use barley and oats or different grasses. I think it's good to have again, this, you don't ever want a monocrop, you always want diversity, and so for the cool weather, those plants. For the hot weather, things like cowpeas, Sudan grass requires very little water. Millet could also be a good choice. Buckwheat grows very quickly, doesn't require a lot of water. I think that using those to keep the ground covered during the summer would have a tremendous advantage. Can I stop and let this
Dog in. This is brilliant information, and it's really wonderful. It needs to be on tape. I know you're shy about that, but it's your life wisdom. You're a living library. You are. You're a living library.
Lots of times walking through the farm, you kind of run into those different areas, and like the animals are strip grazing, and lots of times that's where I can talk about that.
Yeah,
pretty
that
well,
was,
or in the compost yard.
I like the part about the gardener being able to have some cover crop and pull a little strip, because I actually noticed that I have a parsley bed. That is this one bed that I've just kind of kept going as parsley for 3 years now. And I like it because we juice, and we cut the parsley down and eat it as juice mostly. And I've noticed there's this one little furrow, and I thought, I should just put something in there. Just pull the parsley aside, and you just gave me permission to do that. Right. Yeah. So that was really useful for me personally. Yeah. And maybe for other people as well.
Well, we know that the plants, when they're covering the surface, they create a kind of a greenhouse effect that modifies the atmosphere, and wind protects against drying and so forth and so on. So that's where having that plant cover, I think, can be a real advantage to water use, and at the same time it's healthy for the soil and healthy for the plants.
Superior to cardboard mulch or straw, really.
I just intuitively, that's what I would say, yes. But those techniques might have a place in a limited scale. If you're going to go cover 4 acres of vegetables with cardboard, I don't know how effective that would be. Plus, you'd have to really look at what the cardboard had in it and any kinds of things that you might be bringing in. And I kind of prefer to work from this whole farm organism concept, where you're creating everything that you need for your farming out of your own organism, because then you're not bringing in foreign materials that are out of balance to what's in your farm organism and the particular bacterial balances and strains that are developed in that soil. You know, if you go and bring your compost from a compost plant of green waste that's come from an urban area or something, not only do you have a huge carbon footprint, you also are bringing this sort of foreign balance and bacteria and things that aren't really part of your farm organism and might not be totally healthy for it. So I think you can achieve a much stronger health working with the farm as a whole organism that's creating all of its needs out of its own area.
If you wanted to say one more thing, just for the listening audience, any advice you might give them for their own food growing in their backyard, and or what kind of food they could eat this year in this water time and perhaps in the future, as some of us think the water situation is not going to get better. What would you offer for them? What advice would you give the home gardener, food grower, or the eater?
Well, the home gardener, there are certain plants that don't require as much water or can be grown with minimal water. And most plants probably could be grown with a more minimal water supply, like even tomatoes, which do require quite a bit of water. It could be grown with less water if you have the ability to keep, after you do water, to use dry farming type principles and cultivate the surface of the soil so that you break the capillary flow. In compacted soil that's too tightly bound, any water that gets in is just going to be sucked back out by the atmosphere going over that surface. But if you create a dust mulch on the surface, cultivate around your plants, then the water, after you've watered, a day or so after you've watered, you create this dust mulch, then any water that is there will not come totally up to the surface. It'll be blocked from being evaporated by that dust mulch. And so on a home garden scale, that's something that could be applied. And then some of the plants, like I'm thinking potatoes, don't really require huge amounts of water. They grow in this sort of in-between period in the spring when there is maybe some moisture, and then if they get started in time, even if you hit droughtier conditions, they're still going to create a crop. And there are, other plants. I'm thinking squash, possibly. I know in arid areas like the Hopi are able to grow squash and beans, and here again, beans being a legume are something that can kind of somewhat ameliorate their own need for water through nitrogen fixation from the air in a healthy soil. They'll do that. Just try to be more selective with the plants that you do grow and find the ones that can be somewhat dry farmed. I don't think in this part of California it's possible in an inland valley with 100-degree temperatures to totally dry farm crops, because they at some point are just going to collapse from lack of moisture. But you could, through really conscious cultivation after you do water, if you're able to water less frequently, then you could still retain pretty good growth through the way that you managed it.
Could I just get a clarification on that? So I water and then I cultivate, like just literally disturb the soil on the top surface and allow that to dry out. Can you explain just briefly what I might do there? Just quickly tell me how to make that happen.
Well, probably the surface cultivation you'd want to do either with a hoe, where you just, loosen the top inch or two, or you could even use a cultivating fork, which would be like a digging fork but flatter tine that was a little duller. And just work out from your plants and just go in an inch or two and just break the surface. What you're really trying to achieve is to break that crust. If you're getting any compacted crust on the surface, that's what you want to break, because the way capillary flow works is, most people are familiar with two sheets of glass that are placed quite close together in a bowl of water. Well, if they're just a very limited distance apart, the airflow over the top of the sheets of glass will cause the moisture to move up between the glass sheets and get to the top, right? But if you move those sheets further apart, then there's no possibility for flow. So this is what you're doing with that surface layer of a couple of inches of soil. You're getting the particles apart, separated and aerated, so that they become kind of a mulch in themselves. And then the water that is underneath in the soil, in the body of the soil, will come up where it's a little closer in texture, and the plant roots will be into that, but it won't go all the way to the very surface and just get drawn off by the atmosphere. So I think that's the principle of dry farming. And I know in coastal areas where there's lots of atmospheric moisture, for instance, friends of mine dry farm tomatoes in Santa Cruz area, and the fog moisture is enough to keep them alive a good way through the summer. And the fruits are, half the size, but their flavor and intensity is incredible and really good and just more concentrated. And so that's an instance where you can take a plant that likes a lot of water, and certain varieties are going to do better with that than others. So, you have to find out what varieties are good candidates for a dry farming approach. But yeah, that's definitely a technique that can be worked with. And I think in the case of the Hopis, just fertilizing the specific area that they were going to plant those crops, and planting the diversity of the three sisters of the corn, the beans, and the squash. The beans would help with that nitrogen cycle, and any fertilization material that they could put there would be very focused to those particular plants. But then they also would be creating that mulch. They would be creating, shading the soil surface in that area where they're growing. The squash is going to spread out, and the beans a little bit too. They're all working together to achieve a balanced environment that's going to benefit all of them. And so the more we can work with those concepts, maybe the more we can do.